I will be talking about this twin global crisis. The climate crisis and biodiversity loss. We have been facing these twin issues for quite some time, for decades actually, where the fundamentals of life of the biosphere are being challenged or are being threatened. Next slide, please. I would also preface this conversation by saying that my views are my personal views, or as a professional. Nothing related to the organizations that I work for. So, in order to address the biodiversity loss, the Community of Nations created the Global Treaty, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992. And on the climate change or climate crisis, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was also negotiated and adopted. And both these were adopted or opened for signature at the UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED. Some people also refer to it as the Earth Summit in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. So these and another treaty, the Convention to combat desertification and drought, especially in countries of Africa. These three conventions are generally referred to as the Rio Treaties or the Rio Conventions, although the Convention to combat desertification was developed later, but it was a result of the UNCED process. It was there that the idea of the desertification convention was mooted and further developed subsequently. Next slide, please. I will rush through my talk so that you will have enough time to ask questions or for us for discussion. So biodiversity, the global biodiversity is now, the counts stands at 1.75 million species. That is what is known to us, or that is what is known to science or recorded. And biodiversity includes the concept of biodiversity as contained in the Biodiversity Convention, includes the entire spectrum of life on Earth, from microorganisms to the large mammals, wild, cultivated, marine, freshwater, terrestrial. Nothing is included. Ecosystems are also included in the definition of biodiversity as we find in the CBD. So although what is known to science is only 1.75 million species, estimates put the actual numbers of presence of species on the planet much higher multiples. And a recent estimate of IPBES, it's also called IPBES, Intergovernmental platform on science policy, intergovernmental platform on science policy for biodiversity. I am myself missing that full title now. So they have made an estimation that it can range between 8.7 million to 30 million species. When you shake the canopy of a tree in the rainforest of Amazon forest, you get at least a dozen species of insects. So mostly these are insects that are there to be further discovered. But what the estimate tells us is what we know is only a small fraction of what is there. And quite a lot of this could actually vanish before we have the chance to discover and report them. And 30% of this is already endangered, and that is quite worrying. And then we also know that biodiversity is of immense economic value. Economic value in multiple sectors, in agriculture, food, pharmaceuticals, veterinary medicine, cosmetics, and so on. So the values are very high, multi-billion dollars value every year. And if you read the paper by Costanza and his colleagues, it was a multidisciplinary team that produced a paper that was published in Science. Either it was Science or Nature. I am myself confused now. That put the value of biodiversity, the goods and services provided by biodiversity and ecosystems, at $33 trillion. And $33 trillion average, they also have put a wide range. But for a comparison, this trillion, 33 trillion, is very close to the total GDP of all the countries put together. So it is so much important economically. And then communities, whatever biodiversity on Earth is left today is because of the caretaking by the communities, the local communities, the indigenous people in particular. Next slide, please. So CBD marked a very important departure from the doctrine of conservation that was prevailing at that time, and also from the doctrine of conservation adopted by the previous generation of conservation treaties, for example, CITES, then Ramsar Convention, CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, World Heritage Convention. So those conventions were protectionist, focusing entirely on protection, ignoring the fact that biodiversity shares its presence with people, communities, who are the historical caretakers, historical custodians. They also use biodiversity, but in ways that are sustainable. And Biodiversity Convention for the first time recognizes that in its triple objectives: conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of the benefits derived out of the use of biodiversity. And this puts a balance actually across different axes between conservation, sustainable use or development, and a balance between the interest of southern countries, developing countries, and also interests of northern countries, the industrialized countries. Biodiversity Convention recognizes the national sovereign right over biodiversity. Earlier, or an argument raised by Western countries was that biodiversity is a global common. No country can claim national sovereignty over biodiversity. And national global common means, like outer space that doesn't belong to anyone, or the open oceans, the ocean beyond the exclusive economic zones, and so on. This claim of global commons was defeated in the negotiations by developing countries in a very powerful display of negotiation skill and political unity among developing countries. And you must remember that more than 80% of the world's biodiversity is housed, located in countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that we refer to as developing countries or global south. And the convention also recognizes poverty eradication as an objective of countries that bear a huge mass of poor people. And it subsequently, created a program or a policy document on how to address poverty issues by integrating poverty eradication processes with biodiversity management. When Article 10C of the convention recognizes the customary use of biodiversity by the local peoples, it was not stopping them, as some countries with a colonial legacy continue to do, like our country, for example. And Article 8J recognizes the traditional knowledge held by local communities and especially the indigenous people, protecting their traditional knowledge and also recognizing it and elevating it to be used or treated oftentimes with the modern science verified information. Article 15 provides the Western countries' argument was because biodiversity is a global common, the access to biodiversity should be open and free. No country can control it. But in the final text of the treaty, we introduced these provisions. I mean, we stopped that argument of national global common, but then introduced for balancing the provision for access to biodiversity and also access to biodiversity based on benefit sharing conditions. Next slide, please. So the conditions for benefit sharing are the following. Prior informed consent of the country providing biodiversity, mutually agreed terms agreed between the provider and the country providing, and the country means an institution, whoever is the institution, providing biodiversity and also the one which is receiving. And then the third condition is equitable sharing of the benefits derived out of the commercial use of biodiversity. So, so far the Biodiversity Convention, although it's a very powerful tool, and it has created a huge awareness about biodiversity and its importance and the need for sustainable management of biodiversity at various levels, at the political level in particular. National biodiversity strategy and action plans, as required by the CBD, has been developed in most member countries. CBD has 194 member countries, and out of these, 180 countries have developed NBSAPs. The coverage of protected areas across the world, because of the influence of CBD, has increased, and it was at 18% of the 18% of the global area, both terrestrial and oceanic area. 80% of that. Probably it would have made some more increase in the years after 2022. Next slide, please. It has developed the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety in the year 2000. This is to protect the environment and human health from the negative impact of genetically modified organisms. The CBD uses the term living modified organisms and not genetically modified organism, as it actually should have been, because it only considers the living material that are genetically modified, not excluding the products. Food products, for example, are excluded. That was done at the instance of the US. US was although US is not a party to CBD, because it was their idea mainly to recognize biodiversity as a global common. And when that didn't work, and some of the provisions in CBD made them not join Biodiversity Convention, but in the negotiations on a new treaty, a protocol is also like a treaty. So in its negotiations, America was also participating, but then they made all the changes that they wanted to, and then decided not to join the protocol also. And it has a supplementary protocol on liability and compensation for damages caused to other countries due to GMOs or LMOs. Then the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. This was adopted in 2010. It sets the detailed framework and policy directions for practicing ABS, access and benefit sharing. Next slide, please. The convention has developed a program of work in agriculture biodiversity, dry and humid, sub-humid lands, forest biodiversity, inland waters, island biodiversity, marine and coastal biodiversity, mountains, and a program of work also on protected areas. Next slide, please. The convention also had developed 2 strategic plans, and now the 3rd strategic plan is running. The last one that ran from 2011 to 2020 had 20 targets, and it was also known as the Aichi targets. When its term was over, or even before 2020, when the term was over, CBD started the negotiations on a new strategic plan called Global Biodiversity Framework. And the negotiation ran for some 3-4 years, and it was finally adopted in 2002, December. And this is called the Global Biodiversity Framework, and it has received a lot of attention among all the stakeholders, and it's It's based on this implementation that this year's Biodiversity Days theme is also developed. Let's join the plan. The plan actually refers to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. So, although some progress was made, not enough progress. So this is a 2014 document looking at the 20 targets of the Aichi targets. Only 2 items had any significant increase or track a record of progress. 17 and also 11. 17 is about developing NBSAPs and 11 about protected areas, the green ones. So in all other respects, the progress was very low or virtually nil for some of the targets. Next one, please. Now, when the CBD was negotiated and concluded, we thought that will mark an end to biopiracy, the illegal taking of biodiversity, genetic resources from countries like us. But that did not actually stop. In the year 2010, the MOF had said that India was losing 2,000 patents on our biodiversity as well as traditional knowledge. Patents on which were taken out in Western countries without our consent or without following the terms set by CBD. So the Conference of Parties is the ultimate policy-making, decision-making body of CBD. And this has actually failed to address these kind of infractions, these kind of violations, biopiracy. And CBD also has a mechanism for dispute settlement in Article 27, but this has not been activated. Nor is any party means any member country, is asking to activate this mechanism either. And the countries, the terms set in the Biodiversity Convention are very critical, especially for developing countries to which it is beneficial. But then we have also failed to invoke the CBD provisions on ABS when biopiracy is occurring in Western countries. And if and when we challenge, in very rare cases, spending a lot of money in the patent offices, we only use the patent laws. Patent laws are based on the TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property law. These laws, they don't respect biodiversity as a national sovereign right. These laws do not respect the provisions for access and benefit sharing. Therefore, we end up losing cases against biopiracy. Next slide, please. Now, developed or industrial countries are unhappy. They were unhappy from the very start of the CBD, although they joined. But once they joined, they made sure that those provisions of CBD that are not very conducive for them, they somehow played the game and kept it in the back burner. These issues that I'm just going to talk about were, not taken upon on the COP meetings or in many other programs or work developed and so on. Some of these issues that annoy them or that make them uncomfortable with the CBD is the provision of national sovereignty or biodiversity, the provisions of access and benefit sharing, Article 15, which require, the conditions I mentioned earlier. Technology transfer. In order to balance the provision of access to biodiversity in developing countries, the convention also provides, requires parties, developed country parties, that hold technology, modern technology, including biotechnology tools, to transfer such technology to developing countries, not on commercial terms, but on concessional and preferential terms. Not on the market rates, but on concessional and preferential terms. This is also not a largesse or generosity or something. This is something to balance the provision of the convention that allows access to biodiversity that is housed mainly in the global south. Now, because the IPR regimes, intellectual property regimes, that causes impediments to the transfer of technology on concessional and preferential terms, the convention in its Article 16 calls for taking administrative, legal, and policy measures to reform the IPR regimes in order to provide an environment where technology transfer can be done on concessional and preferential terms. And the convention also provides an important but very annoying term or provision for Western countries, that is Article 14.2. It calls for liability holding countries that cause biodiversity beyond their borders through their willful actions. Not necessarily willful, it can be also accidental actions. If it is causing damage to biodiversity beyond their territories, beyond their jurisdiction, they are liable to pay compensation to the affected countries. Like there was a British, this is not directly related, but do you remember maybe some 10 years ago, the British Petroleum had a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Then the American President Obama, he asked $20 billion from British Petroleum to pay them, and the company immediately paid. Not only $20 billion, they paid up to $60 billion to various claimants. But if it was in Bhopal, or if it was Coca-Cola in Plachimada, they go to the courts and drag the case, and they hardly pay anything in compensation. So this is the double standards. The CBD provides this provision, which makes Western countries uncomfortable. And the CBD also requires participation on research on species that are in developing countries, the equal participation of scientists and research institutions from developing countries in such joint research projects. It is not that you take away our specimens, our samples, and do research in your laboratory and create out of it whatever you want. No. CBD puts an end to that, although not practiced, I must say, as some of you would also know. Then the biosafety article, which is also important. It was based on that the biosafety protocol or Cartagena protocol was developed further. Next one, please. Now, this is my perception of the reasons why the implementation of CBD is weak, because the G77, the group of developing countries, they lost their unity, they lost their steam. And Western countries were also making the argument CBD is not to be implemented article by article, but it is a framework convention and articles have to be expanded and so on. and it's not legally binding. Some people are claiming all that is false. It's not true. It's CBD is a convention to be implemented. Every one of its article is to be operative article is to be implemented, and it's legally binding. Next one, please. And I was mentioning earlier IPBES, the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform. Oh, it's a very long name. I also sometimes forget it. So this was also created. This is also a Western creation. This did not come out of a very serious need for such a platform. CBD also has a body, a subsidiary body on science, technology, scientific, technical, and technological affairs, called Substaff. So when that body is there, there was actually no need for this, but then this was also started at the initiative or the insistence of France. Next slide, please. Now, I was talking about the global biodiversity framework, which was adopted in 2022, which will run up to the year 2030, and it also has its goals set on 2050. It has 4 goals: protecting and enhancing biodiversity, and increasing the natural ecosystems by the year 2050, by when we, the humans, should be able to live in harmony with nature. I'm not sure if that will happen. Then sustainable use, safeguarding and promoting nature's contribution to people, sustainable use of biodiversity resources, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived out of the use of biodiversity. And then it has also estimated the cost of biodiversity management at $700 billion per year. So this also set a commitment on the part of industrial countries to provide support, financial support. The benefit of biodiversity conservation is global, not just if we are protecting in India, the benefit is not just for Indians, but it is for the whole world. And therefore, Western countries who have a history of destroying forests and biodiversity in Asia, Africa, and Americas, both Americas, have this history of destruction of biodiversity, and indigenous people have to have this obligation to pay some kind of historical compensation as well. The global biodiversity framework has a total of 23 targets to realize these 4 goals. Targets from 1 to 8, this addresses the different threats faced by biodiversity. And then targets 9 to 13 are about sustainable use and benefit sharing. Then targets 14 to 23 are about the means of implementation of the biodiversity framework and bringing it to the mainstream. Next slide, please. Now, so the Substar is it's in the implementation phase. Sorry, the GBF is in the implementation phase. And last week, ending last week, was the meeting of the subsidiary body of CBD on scientific, technical, and technological matters, Substar. They were also discussing the development of a monitoring framework for biodiversity framework. Now, let's hope that the attention from the CBD convention itself will not be diverted, but remain focused. And at the same time, the framework GBF will be implemented by different countries. So we'll now take a quick look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was adopted, as I said, in 1992, and then it had a protocol developed in 2005, and then another landmark was the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015. Next slide, please. The CBD, the UNFCCC sets the goal of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. This was adopted when the convention was adopted in 1990. So the baseline year was set as 1990, and it set the goal of reducing carbon dioxide emissions to 1990 level by the year 2000. So the idea was to stop carbon dioxide emissions further, and the trend of that time has to be changed so that by the year 2020 it doesn't overtake the emission levels of 1990. The CBD, the UN Framework Convention, also recognizes common but differentiated responsibility. All countries have a common responsibility to reduce carbon dioxide emission, but developed countries, on account of their having contributed the largest amount of global warming gases since the Industrial Revolution period, they have a larger obligation to reduce carbon dioxide emission, whereas developing countries, most of which host a large number of poor people, also need to develop to improve their livelihood conditions. Therefore, they also have to have some carbon space. That is the common but differentiated responsibility. And in the UNFCCC, the carbon emission reduction was voluntary, not mandatory. And when I said the common but differentiated responsibility, the background is that some industrial countries, US for example, they cause their emission level is 10 times that of India, for example. That is the per capita emission. While the per capita emission of India is 1.7 metric ton, for US it is 16.5. For some other countries, it is much less. It is the carbon dioxide emission is per capita, especially some other Asian or African countries, the per capita carbon emission is very further low. But also we must also recognize the carbon dioxide emission of the class that holds India's 60% of India's wealth, the 1% that holds India's 60% of India's wealth, and their carbon dioxide emission, and in the carbon dioxide emission by the poor, the marginalized people, those who live in the slums, those who the Adivasi people and other deprived communities, their carbon, there is a huge disparity between these. And therefore, in a way, India's rich is actually using the poor as a shield to protect their own carbon dioxide emission. That has to be also questioned. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Can you move? Never mind if you cannot move the slide. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, okay. So we now leave the presentation, and my time is also up. So then following this, when the countries looked back in the year 2000, they found that the objective or the goal of UNFCCC was not achieved, in the sense that the carbon reduction was not achieved by the year 2000. It was even more than greater on a great scale than the 1990 level. And therefore, countries started negotiating a new protocol, that is the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in the year 2005, and it came to force in 2007. And then it had a period of, it ran up to 2012, and it also had an extension period. And then when the no need for slides, you can stop it. So when the Kyoto Protocol made it mandatory for Annex 1 countries, industrialized countries, to reduce carbon dioxide, while for other countries, developing countries, it was only voluntary. And the greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced by 5% below the baseline year of 1990 during the implementation period of the Kyoto Protocol, that is 2008 to 2012. And this was then succeeded by the Paris Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol, although it required the developed countries to reduce carbon dioxide, you can move the slide. It also gave provisions for avoiding their mandatory responsibilities to some extent by joint projects. They can have joint project with another country and then share the carbon credit of that country. Then also carbon trading. Developed countries can give money for a certain project in a developing country and take the credit for whatever carbon dioxide emission is avoided through that project. Next slide, please. So then the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 after a lot of protracted negotiations. But then it is hailed as a big achievement, but if you look at it, it also has issues like it's not mandatory. Kyoto Protocol was at least mandatory, whereas Paris Agreement, the carbon dioxide emission reduction is not mandatory, but it is nationally determined. NDC, nationally determined contribution in carbon dioxide emission reduction. Climate justice is missing. India was an important negotiator during the formation of UNFCCC and also CBD. And India also played a part in introducing the common but differentiated responsibility. But that was missing in the Paris Agreement. By the time the Paris Agreement was negotiated, India lost that kind of concern and also the negotiation capacities. And therefore, although there is this term climate justice there, but it is not operative. It is not operational in any of the articles. It is just making a very vague statement about climate justice. So the Paris Agreement sets to limit carbon dioxide, the global warming within 2 degrees, above the pre-industrial revolution period, that is 1850 to 1900, and with an aspiration to further limit it within 1.5 degrees above the industrial revolution period. So now 1.5 degrees is taken as the target, although it was started as an aspiration. Although we are not sure whether that would be achieved, at this level of carbon dioxide that's happening. Now, the Paris Agreement also talks about $100 billion per year in order for developing countries to reduce to meet the climate change related requirements. But there is no firm commitment on this contribution. If you also look at the figure I mentioned for the global biodiversity framework, where the amount was 7 times more than this. Hello? That was a 700 billion, whereas in the climate sector, it's only 100 billion. Next slide, please. Now, some of the issues, the US being a major world power, has been threatening, and then they withdrew, and then they rejoined when there was a change in the president in that country. And they were never a part of Kyoto Protocol. They were not part of CBD. They were not part of Kyoto Protocol. They were not part of any of the protocols of CBD. They were not part of the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of hazardous substance. Most of the important such conventions, they stay out. Now, the forests have now a new perception, are perceived in a new way as sinks for the carbon dioxide that they produce. Forests are home for biodiversity. Forests are home for people. Forests are also resources to be used sustainably. But that idea is changing now. Forests are increasingly being seen as the sinks to sequester carbon dioxide. Then the false solutions like carbon trading, then geoengineering. There are multiple measures like hiding the sun or reflecting the sunlight using certain kind of lenses and glasses. Then ocean fertilization, trying to artificially fertilize the ocean by dumping iron into the ocean, iron ores into the ocean, and so on, which will create, for example, a huge, massive algal bloom. And they think the carbon dioxide, the carbon absorbed by the alga, it gets sequestered under the ocean, in the ocean floor, and so on. So those solutions are actually false. They don't help. The only solution is reducing the carbon dioxide emission, and also to reduce the use of fossil fuels. There are also interesting things happening. For example, the Dubai conference of the COP of UNCCC has established a commission on loss and damage to provide compensation for countries or societies that suffer loss and damage due to climate change. That is also happening. Now, also the legality of countries not taking effective action to reduce carbon dioxide emission and thereby global warming is also being questioned in the International Court of Justice, the World Court. So the proceedings are going on. Next slide, please. Now, this climate crisis is already being played out. If you remember the deluge in Kerala, 2018, some people said it was due to the loss of forest. It was not due to loss of forest. Actually, there was an increase in the forest cover, according to the Forest Survey of India report of 2017 during its reporting period and the previous reporting period. So it was definitely a result of global warming. And recently there was also in Dubai, also there was a massive flood. In just 2 years, they got rains that they normally get in one full year. In Kerala too, the rain that we got in Kerala in the month of August was something like that you get during the entire monsoon season in 3 months. So when that is exactly what climate change will happen. The pattern of rainfall will change. Next slide, please. So what we are facing is not just an environmental issue as we used to see it as a fragmented sectoral issue, but it's a huge civilizational crisis. Is questioning even the existence of what we call modern civilization. So 55 gigaton carbon dioxide emission is predicted by the UNFCCC by the year 2030. That is a massive threat. Now, on the other hand, we'll see the exhaustion of entire oil resource by the year 2060. So it is upon this that modern civilization is built. That is the basic fuel for modern civilization. So that will be over. Now, the inclusive human physiological fitness is constantly declining. Unlike any other natural species or the 1.75 million species that we know, ours is dependent on medical support. And when medical support is absent, human life remains threatened. We are no longer an autonomous, independent species. And together with all that, the accelerating loss of biodiversity. So all these are promising as a massive civilizational crisis that is already underway, but barely recognized. But in the coming years, the crisis will become more visible unless effective measures are taken by countries, powerful economies, and the corporate sector. The damage is not caused by humans. The damage is caused by the corporates that have technology and the capital to cause such power. So let us not allow them to hide themselves behind the generic description of humans. It's not humans. The 10 crore Adivasis of India, they have had no role in creating this crisis. So let us not allow the corporates and the powers that have capital and technology to destroy nature and the environmental resilience to share the blame with the rest of humanity, which are actually the victims of their thoughtless, greedy actions. So I wish you all the best, and if you have questions, we can quickly have a